You're now watching two old farts making noises.
Joe, do you want to know why some businesses succeed and some businesses fail? Why some businesses grow and some businesses don't? That's what this show is all about. Business, business, business.
All right. Welcome back to the Lost Dollar Business Club. How are you, gentlemen?
Good to see you, Michael.
Great.
All right. We're missing John. We're missing Little John. We don't have him this week, and we're not.
And we're missing Big Dave.
And we're missing Big Dave. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But that's because of the time shift. Because we have a special guest. This is the big day to bring on.
We have the guy who wrote this book.
There you go. You've got the book. Cory Doctorow is a science fiction author and activist and journalist, and he's written many, many books. But the most recent one is what we'll be talking about, The Internet Con, How to Seize the Means of Computation, which is what he calls a big tech disassembly manual. But he's also written a book called Choke Point Capitalism, which is nonfiction about monopolies and creative labor markets. And in 2020, he was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. So I've actually read some of his fiction work and found it very intriguing around tech feudalism. So let's bring Cory onto the show.
And we have to hit another button. This is why we need
another button. You got another button.
There you go. One more button. There's Cory. Hi, Cory.
All right, Cory. Thanks for joining the show. Great to see you here. Oh, it looks like he's on mute or something.
Oh, sorry. I hit the button on my mic that cuts it off at the source.
It's like double mute, you know.
He was yelling at his manager going, "Why did you put me on this show?" That's what he was doing. And now he's ready to go and we're good to go.
That's right. Well, Cory, it's great to have you on. You've done a lot of work, fiction and nonfiction, and there's a lot in the tech space to be talking about. So I gave you a little bit of preview about some of the things we wanted to talk about, the Internet Con, first of all. But I mean, tell us, what is seizing the means of computation, and why is that even important?
Well, you know, the internet didn't have to become 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. The way that we got here is that we made a couple of choices. And the first one, the most consequential one, is we suspended the historic rules to prevent monopolies from forming. So we allowed companies to buy their small competitors, to merge with their big competitors, to do predatory pricing, where you sell things below cost so that other people can't enter the market, and to otherwise kind of break the letter of antitrust law as it stands in this country. And that allowed all kinds of sectors to become wildly concentrated. So that's not just tech, but, 5 giant publishers, 4 giant studios, 3 giant labels, 2 giant ad tech companies, 1 company that does all the ebooks and audiobooks, or, the 3 companies that do all the world shipping, or the 1 professional wrestling league that bought the other 30, or the 1 company that owns every eyeglass brand you've ever heard of, as well as every eyeglass store you've ever been to, as well as making more than half the world's lenses and being the largest eyewear insurer in the world. So everywhere you look, you have this. And that let the tech companies become, when they were that concentrated, become de facto self-regulators. They could take over their regulators because they would go to Congress or Parliament and they would all speak with one voice. When there's only 5 companies, it's easy to fit around a single table and decide what you're going to tell Congress. And that means that on the one hand, they were able to create a world in which the normal laws didn't apply to them. Labor, privacy, fair trading laws. If you add with an app to something that would be a crime in the real world, suddenly you can get away with it. And at the same time, they were able to pass or extend new technology laws that restricted other people, new businesses, co-ops, and individuals from taking action to modify those services to frustrate the interests of their shareholders and give themselves more protection. Like 1 in 4 internet users has installed a web-based tracking and ad blocker. It's the largest consumer boycott in human history. But if you were to try and do that with an app, well, you would have to first reverse engineer the app. And Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act attaches felony liability to that. You go to prison for 5 years and pay a $500,000 fine for a first offense. So you can think of an app as just being like a web page that it's illegal to modify so it doesn't hurt you. And so seizing the means of computation boils down to, on the one hand, putting constraints on how companies use the technology that we rely on to spy on us, to rip us off, to abuse our labor rights. And on the other hand, restoring the historic character of rights that we had to technology, to adapt it so that it serves our interests, even if that's antithetical to the interests of the company that made it.
Nice. Well, and you've talked you talk a lot about this concept, the concept of concentrated industries, as these are essentially monopolies. And you made an interesting point that our founding fathers would have protested against this. And we talk about, we're a global show in a way, but we do talk about a lot of American-centric topics, business world topics. And I mean, why do you think by the people, of the people, for the people is incompatible with concentrated corporate power?
Well, let me say, like all the best Americans, I'm a Canadian, and the framers weren't shy about their concerns about monopoly, and what it would mean for the new republic if large firms were able to fuse themselves with the government and then extract money from their customers and their workers, backed by the power of the state. I mean, that's what the Boston Tea Party was, right? That's what the British, Hudson's Bay Company and all the firms that worked hand in glove with the British Navy to establish the American colonies and then to extract huge amounts of money from American colonists. My kid is doing AP US history. She was born and raised in the UK, so I'm spending a lot of time helping her. And boy, oh boy, like the story of monopoly is all over the story of the founding of the American colony. The historically with digital technology, because it is so flexible, right? Because the only kind of computer we know how to make is the Turing complete universal von Neumann machine. There's a lot of computer science jargon that just means that it's a computer that can run every program we know how to write. That meant that whenever someone did something obnoxious, with your browser, like putting a pop-up ad in it, someone else could make a pop-up blocker. And in fact, that was a business opportunity, right? Like the fact that someone else was making their product worse was an opportunity for someone else to make that product better and charge money for it and eventually take them over. And I think that that's something that the framers were quite alive to. And it's indeed the historic basis for antitrust law. When John Sherman, the senator who created the Sherman Act, the first antitrust law, Tecumseh Sherman's brother, when he was stumping for the Sherman Act in 1890, he laid out the case. He said, if we would not endure a king to rule over us in affairs of state, we should not endure an autocrat of trade who will structure our lives. We tend to think of free markets as markets free from regulators, but Adam Smith talked about markets free from rents, right? Free from people who are unelected owners of things that are necessary for production, who get to structure that production, right? Like in Canada, there's a proposal right now for some pretty light touch, although I think not great, rules about registering the very largest podcasts. If you've got more than, I think, 10 million a year, you're going to have to fill in the same paperwork that you do if you're a broadcaster. I think it's a kind of a foolish adventure. But, when people say, oh, well, podcasting is a big, wide open platform that anyone can participate in, and this is, intervening with the hand of the state, they ignore the fact that podcasting has a regulator. It's called Apple. And if Apple removes you from the podcasting ecosystem, you effectively cease to exist. In the same way that Amazon, if they remove you from the store, basically puts you out of business. And so we have these regulators. And so the question ends up becoming, as John Sherman knew, are we going to have democratically accountable lawmakers who figure out what we're going to do? Or are we going to have shareholder accountable giant firms who decide what we can and can't do, what industry can and can't exist, and how it must conduct itself?
Well, we can take that one step further, though, because if you look at what Twitter or X, whatever they want to call themselves this week, is doing, almost with freedom of speech, going to your, can a company govern what you do or say? Yes, apparently. and so can Facebook, and so can this one. I know right now in the Financial Times, they were literally article after article, and even in The Economist was saying, what are they going to do now because of what Hamas did in Israel? So this is a big thing. Like, what's people going to say? What are they going to pull back? What are they going to allow? Either you have to allow everything or you police everything, to your point.
Yeah,
So it's a little different, but
I think there's a little
different.
nuance. I think there's a little nuance there, but you're getting at something important, which is that
Right.
People will tell you that formally the First Amendment only applies to state action. So private entities can always restrict expression. Like a publisher is under no obligation to publish every book you send them. Right? They get to choose what they publish, and freedom of speech includes freedom from compelled speech. So one of the things that we've historically been very leery of in this country is the government ordering newspapers to print certain things or ordering the news to carry certain news, right? So both compelled speech and censorship are what we think about when we think of the First Amendment. But the First Amendment isn't the last word in censorship, right? When your friend says, I'm sorry, you can't be in my house unless you agree with me that vaccines are dangerous and I'm going to kick you out. It's a censorious act. Now, it doesn't have the same weight as when the government does it, but where it acquires that weight of the state is when the government allows one or a small number of firms to corner the market for speech venues, right? When they don't enforce antitrust law, so that a company like, say, Facebook can observe that their users are fleeing in droves for a startup called Instagram and just make an anti-competitive purchase of Instagram. As Mark Zuckerberg says, it is better to buy than to compete, which is something that, prior to the Reagan era would have landed him in court if he tried to act on that principle. And today it's like a Harvard Business Review case study. And so when the government allows all the speech forums to be cornered by one market, when they decline to enforce the laws that are supposed to prevent a concentration of corporate power, and then those corporations exercise their historic ability to regulate speech within their forums, the restaurateur doesn't have to allow you to stay in your booth if you stand up and start screaming racist nonsense. They can sling your ass to the curb, which is fine. But if they're the only restaurant in town and we don't have any public sidewalks out front of the restaurant where the First Amendment applies, then what you end up with is with that one restaurant chain deciding what can be said over dinner. And that becomes a much more consequential censorship concern. Even if formally it doesn't fall under the First Amendment, it is still reaching to the same concerns about speech that animated the passage of the First Amendment.
I think there's an important point in there is that the poison of the snake is in the head, not the tail. And if you look at the political landscapes of both countries, how many of those in the United States politicians are truly constitutionalists?
No, we lost Kurt.
We lost you, Kurt.
Kurt, your mic cuts out when you're getting a ring. But I heard how many people are truly constitutionalists.
Yeah,
Well,
they're putting that first, right? Because if they were truly putting that first and the will of the people first, it wouldn't be such a nightmare that it is now. But they're not. They're focusing on themselves, their power, the big business, those who they have contact with. So the people become second.
And the meaning of the Constitution is far from crisp, right? Like the Constitution it has these flexibilities built into it, in part in order to accommodate new circumstances. And what government of the people, by the people, for the people, or all men are created equal means has changed through the years. And Canada, of course, only patriated its constitution in, I think, 1982. So it operated instead on the basis of common law as a British colony until then, or a member of the Commonwealth anyway. And so I think you're right that there are a lot of people in the halls of power who claim to be strict constitutionalists, but are extremely selective in what parts of the Constitution they pay attention to. But I also don't want to claim that there's like that like we're all sitting in Plato's cave looking at the shadow of the Constitution on the wall, but periodically we can look over our shoulder and find out what it really means, right? Like there will always be room for like legitimate disagreement about what the Constitution means and what, like this is the, not to get too far afield here, but this is what all those crypto weirdos discovered with smart contracts, where they were like, why do people even sue each other over contracts? If you just wrote the contract clearly enough, like a computer program, then there would be no disputes over contract. And that just like, I mean, it's the problem with just sort of reasoning from first principles, right? Without actually asking an expert why they do things the way they do, and just assuming, oh, lawyers are stupid and engineers are smart, or lawyers are, self-interested scammers who want there to be ambiguity in contracts because then you'll have to hire a lawyer to resolve that ambiguity. And like, boy, oh boy, did people lose a lot of money discovering that was wrong.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, and this, I'm glad you bring up the legal aspect of this, because we talked about this we talked about Lena Khan and her antitrust efforts as FTC chair on one of our previous shows, in anticipation of this show. I mean, was it inevitable that we would get somebody going against the consumer welfare standard? And what are your thoughts on what she's doing now to maybe reverse this multi-decade effort to allow monopolies and trusts?
Well, I think that, as to inevitability, there's Stein's law that says that anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. And, like the extent to which, monopolies are a drag on the real economy and a corrupting force in our politics and a danger to our society, that just gets more clear every day. Now, of course, one of the problems is that sometimes the point of peak indifference where we decide to take action comes long after the point of no return, right? And monopolies are notoriously hard to get rid of, which is why through most of American history, the emphasis was on preventing monopoly formation rather than reacting to monopolies. When AT&T or IBM was dragged into court in 1970 at last over its illegal conduct, there followed a 12-year period. And every one of those years, IBM spent more on outside counsel to represent it against the Department of Justice Antitrust Division than the Department of Justice Antitrust Division spent on every lawyer fighting every case in the United States. They outspent the US government for 12 consecutive years. They call it antitrust's Vietnam. And in the end, they ran out the clock. Ronald Reagan got elected and just dropped the case against them. And so, this is one of the points that I'm always at pains to make, is even if you're like the kind of capital libertarian who's only got one book on your bookshelf and it's the Fountainhead and you can't even read it anymore because the pages are all stuck together, and the only thing you think the government should ever do is enforce contracts between companies, like, for them to enforce the contracts, they have to be more powerful than the companies. And so the smallest government you have to have has to be larger than the largest company you're willing to have. And so if you really want small government, you need smaller companies, right? So was Khan inevitable? Well, something was going to happen eventually. But Khan herself, her elevation first to the FTC and then to the chair, was, I think, far from inevitable, highly contingent. So like, I don't want to undersell how brilliant she is. She is a force of nature. There are some days where I get up and I'm like, everything is terrible, but at least there are like high-ranking civil servants who genuinely care about the American people and are in a position of power, and they're using that power to advocate for real, meaningful, substantive change. Like, it is so good to live in a world with Lena Khan in it. And she's very brilliant. Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, probably the best law review article you'll ever read. I think most of us, the number of law review articles we read is, practically speaking, indistinguishable from zero. But if you were to go ahead and read it, you would have a good time. It's good.
I did actually start reading it for that reason, because it was recommended there, and she obviously is very brilliant. It's amazing to me that it took this landmark kind of paper to get people to finally wake up in the public forum.
Yeah,
it
was two other things, right? So one was the realization among conservatives that no corporation loves them as much as they love corporations, and that like their 40-year project of advocating for corporate control and monopoly had yielded a world in which people who didn't give a shit about what their most unhinged members wanted to say in the culture wars, were willing to just block them from speaking. And all of a sudden they all woke up one day and they were like, oh, wait, we didn't want this monopoly. We wanted the monopoly that was friendly to our interests. Like when it was doing this, when it was deplatforming trans people and sex workers and indigenous activists, that was fine. But now that they're deplatforming like Ben Shapiro, that's a problem. And so you had this moment where you had members of the Senate from the Republican Party who were willing to approve Khan's confirmation, right, as a way to, like, I think largely incoherent statement about corporate power. And so that was very contingent. And then you had Biden, who put her in the chair seat. And I think that's not because Biden himself is like a fire-breathing reformer. I actually don't think anyone knows what Biden's politics are, because he's such a political animal that his politics always take a back seat to what he thinks he can do to kind of serve in this role as kind of a mediator between different factions of the Democratic Party. But one faction of the Democratic Party is the Sanders-Warren wing, who are extremely skeptical of corporate power and who are important enough to the Democratic coalition that Biden gave them some stuff. And one of the things he gave them was Khan. Now, it wasn't an unmitigated win because he also appointed judges from the Clinton corporate wing of the party who have gone on to rule against Khan. So, this is the problem with I've heard it called pizza burger politics, right? You're one half of your family wants pizza for dinner, the other half wants burgers for dinner. So you make a pizza burger and they're all equally unhappy. So this pizza burger politics, where it's like half the Democratic Party wants to curb corporate power, the other half wants to curry corporate power. And so you have some appointments that are going to do one and some appointments that are going to do the other, and nothing, everyone's fought to a standstill. That is not really the kind of balance I would hope for. But Khan is still, like, not just in court, but everywhere, kicking a lot of ass. And even the court cases she's losing are spooking M&A people who are saying, like, maybe we won't do that anti-competitive merger, because even if we did eventually prevail in court, the 2 years we'd spend fighting this are not worth it. Let's just move on.
That's fantastic. To me, it's fantastic to hear that kind of activism happening at that level. And you've done a lot of writing on, let's talk a little bit more about the Internet Con and breaking up big tech, or at least controlling what is now already a beast of several companies, or just beasts. But it goes down to, I wanted to get into a little explanation as to why big tech is different. Now, you've talked about universality and the foundationness or the foundationalness of big tech. Can you talk more about why this is kind of a special case, why technology in particular is a special case?
Yeah, I mean, tech exceptionalism is a sin, right? The people are like, oh, it's not bad when tech does it, because it's going to save us all. That is definitely nonsense. But there are some ways in which tech is very exceptional. So one is that digital technology has this flexibility, right? These universal Turing complete von Neumann machines, which means that on the one hand, like, it's always going to be possible, if you have the legal right to do so, to reverse engineer and modify the technology you use so that it serves you better, even if that comes at the expense of the company that made it, right? There's no technical reason you can't install new software on your printer that just cheerfully accepts third-party ink, instead of making you pay like more than vintage Veuve Clicquot for, commodity ink for your printer. It's just that there's like this legal prohibition against it. So on the one hand, if we were to eliminate those legal prohibitions or temper them so that you had to establish that, if someone reverse engineered their device or made a product to reverse engineer the device, that it wasn't unlawful to do that merely because the shareholders just preferred it, but because, you violated privacy law, or you defrauded someone, or you abused their rights as a worker, right? Like Uber's got this thing where they try to get drivers to drive more. The more drivers there are on the road, the more availability there is and the more valuable Uber becomes. And Uber doesn't pay drivers for the time they spend circling, waiting to get a ride. And so Uber drivers, they split themselves into two camps. They call themselves either ants or pickers, and pickers are picky and only take the highest value rides, and ants take every ride that's thrown their way. And Uber wants you to be an ant and not a picker. And pickers, by definition, they've got other sources of income. They've got other hustles. Otherwise, you couldn't afford to be a picker. And so Uber's payment algorithm does this thing that Vina Duval calls algorithmic wage discrimination, which is one of these other things that would be illegal, except they do it with an app. And that's that if you are picky about your rides, they offer you more per ride than someone who is less selective. And then as you become less selective yourself, the amount offered for each ride goes down. And I think the underlying logic here is that if you're giving up the other side hustles that let you be picky, then you can't afford to be picky anymore. But if you back off, right, if you become less selective and then you become more selective, the algorithm raises your pay. Now, like, this is a fairly common kind of bid and accept dynamic. And if you're familiar at all with things like algorithmic stock trading, the stock market is full of bots that do bids and puts in order to kind of elicit higher prices for things they're selling or to yield up lower prices for things they're buying. There's no reason technically that as an Uber driver, you couldn't have a counter algorithm that basically just guesses whether you should turn down a ride based on how much it's being offered, like looks at the historic record for what you're being offered and tries to keep that maximum, and even networks with other Uber drivers so that you coordinate refusing low paid rides, right? It's just that the act of reverse engineering could put you in prison for half a decade. You know, the actual thing is the actual act is not technically hard to imagine. And so there's this exceptionalism to tech in that, like, yeah, we should in fact establish that algorithmic wage discrimination, like other forms of wage discrimination, is unlawful. But we don't have to wait for a lengthy court case and a finding of fact and enforcement action in order to give immediate relief to workers, in addition to having the state discipline these firms for their unlawful acts. We could also offer immediate relief to workers by just giving them the app. And so this is exceptional because a McDonald's worker can't do this if they're having their wages stolen, right? It's only when your boss is an app. It's only when you're in this digital realm that this flexibility arises.
That's
you can do this stuff. So that's one way in which it's exceptional. The other way it's exceptional is that although the internet isn't more important than like the climate emergency or struggles for labor justice or gender justice or other forms of social justice, racial justice, and so on, it is the battleground on which these fights will be fought. And if we don't have a free, fair, and open internet, we lose those fights before we even join them. You know, speaking as someone who spent his teenage years riding around on a bicycle all night in Toronto with like a bucket full of wheat paste and like 1,000 handbills to stick up on telephone poles to get people out to protest, like, you cannot organize mass movements without digital tools, without incurring an extremely heavy penalty in terms of labor and energy that you have to put into it.
And it's problematic that now that you've talked about this in the Internet Con in the book as well, that regulators are not really regulating tech anymore, mostly due to monopoly influence, and more so the monopoly influence rather than not being able to understand what's going on in the technology.
Yeah, we tend to like overweight on the like theory that Congress is full of old people who are stupid.
Right.
And
they're just full of young people that are stupid. So
and young people are stupid, right?
It
And
works,
you know,
works
the
well.
infamous Zuckerberg quote, you know, how do you make your money? We sell ads, Senator. You know, but the reality is that, like, the thing that has killed more people than anything probably is bad drinking water. And there are no water chemists in
Right.
Congress, and yet we're all still here. You don't have to be a technical expert to make good technical law. You need to have a good regulatory process, a good fact-finding process to figure out what the rules are. And monopolies frustrate those fact-finding processes. They undermine them, sometimes fatally. And in the UK, where there's a monopoly now, private monopoly on water, because they privatized the water system, you can see this playing out in real time because the water regulator became captured by this monopoly water provider, which convinced it that it was okay for them to dump raw sewage in the waterways of the UK. And literally the rivers, streams, and beaches of the UK are just full of human turds, right? Like, you could not ask for a clearer metaphor for what happens when monopolists take over your regulatory process. So, you know, this is the problem of monopoly. And you know, when a sector dwindles to a handful of firms, it's very easy for them to figure out what priorities they have and then to speak with one voice to Congress or to their regulators about those priorities. You know, if you remember in the Napster war era, right, there were like 7 giant tech companies or 7 giant entertainment companies rather, that in aggregate were like 1/10 the size of the the tech sector they were fighting, but they ran circles around the tech sector. And that's because the tech sector was then competitive. There were a couple hundred companies. The entertainment sector, they could, fit around one table and agree on what they were going to tell Congress. The tech sector, they couldn't even agree on like where to hold the meeting or how to cater it, much less, a single position. And so they got trounced. Now, today, tech is so concentrated, it might as well have a Habsburg jaw. And they are able and consistently do speak with one voice about their regulatory priorities. And they are kicking Congress's ass, right? And it's because they are that concentrated.
Go ahead, Stephen.
No, I was going to say, but your point about why our Congress, I mean, I'm sure in Canada it's better because you have moose there. But in our Congress, the problem is that they're only in DC for like 5 minutes, because as I spoke to a congressman and a senator, and I said, so like, why don't you spend more time, I don't know, doing your job? He goes, my job is to raise money.
Raise money. Yeah.
And that's all I do. He said, I go to DC for 2 or 3 days. I do whatever I can do. My staff does. And he said, then we're back pressing the flesh, trying to raise money. That's why they can't, whether you could be the dumbest person or the smartest person there, unless you are like the only person in your district ever running, you don't have 500 hours to sit there and read a bill and understand it. And so in a way I feel for them, but in a way it's up to them to change that system.
Yeah. Although,
that's an system.
I think that we can see these things as having different causal relationships. So like Monopoly created the excess profits and the unity of purpose to take the restrictions off of campaign financing, which created this arms race where, the amount of money you need to raise to win a seat has gone up exponentially. And so the amount of time that you can spend exercising the power the seat affords you has gone down, because there's a single time budget that fundraising and lawmaking comes out of, as you just pointed out. And so, this is going back to John Sherman and autocrats of trade, that like once your country becomes an oligarchy, everything becomes distorted. And this is just one of the many ways in which this is distorted. And again, like, the great failure of the consumer welfare theory, which I gather you've talked about, so I won't dig into what it means here, is the idea that you can reactively police monopolies once they form if they go sour. But the realization that drove the Sherman Act and that drove anti-monopoly policy since the Boston Tea Party has been that once monopolists achieve scale, they effectively slip the leash, and that it becomes a project of years to put them back on the leash.
Well, AT&T was the perfect example. We broke it up and now it's back.
Well, we broke them up and then we stopped enforcing antitrust, right?
Right.
And then we let them reform.
Right. So it's sort of like, well, that was cute. The attorneys made money, and so the investment bankers, which, the oldest profession.
I mean,
what
happened there though was like, I think the effort to break up AT&T was in earnest, and then Reagan took office, and then he knew that AT&T and IBM together were strangling the American high-tech sector, and he needed to get rid of one. And ideologically, AT&T was the one that was most palatable to his machine, because AT&T could be argued to have been a regulated monopoly and thus not a creature of the market to begin with. So the reason they dropped the IBM case and then held up the AT&T case and carried it through was for this ideological reason. And the AT&T breakup did do a lot, right? Like the AT&T project up until that moment was stopping Americans from having modems, right? Because they understood that once you had networks where capabilities were determined at the edge instead of in the central office, that people would be able to roll out new features for the network without AT&T being able to tax it. And so, that's how we got the internet. That's how we got all these interactive services.
Don't tell Gore that. He'll get very upset because he invented it. I don't know if you read it.
It's something.
We're not going to go there. I'm just.
He didn't really say it. I've met many criticisms of Al Gore, but he didn't say that.
I know. He said it's actually his dad was the one who passed the laws that got it there.
And he oversaw the demilitarization of the internet. He did the National Information Infrastructure hearings.
Right. I like to say that because it gets everybody's blood going.
Declan McCullough said that, and it's not true. That's where it all comes from. Declan McCullough said it.
Now,
it's not true.
The other thing which is interesting, we're talking about monopolies and whatnot. So today, if I'm not mistaken, Microsoft's $69 billion acquisition of whatever. Activision just got approved. I was reading it just before you came on, and I'm laughing to myself. I go, "Oh, we're going to be talking about this today." So, to your point, if you have enough dollars or any other currency, you can get away with murder in any of the countries.
Yeah.
And it really is a sad thing. Like the little guy can't do anything because they'll either crush him, buy him, or just, throw money to destroy him.
Yeah, a lot of people, they toss around the word feudalist the way they toss around the word fascist, right? It's just like
Right.
anyone who's old fashioned is a feudalist. Anyone I disagree with is a feudalist, right? Or the other way around.
Fascist.
But a fascist, yeah. But the reality is that there's like a very sharp distinction between fascism or fascism, between feudalism and capitalism, and they were bitter enemies. The feudalists and the capitalists. The feudalists, what they wanted to have was passive income. Right? They wanted to own some land, and then there would be peasants who would be bound to the land. They would be required to live there. Peasants weren't allowed to leave the manor they were born in. And they owned their own means of production. They owned the plow and the seed and the whatever. And the landlord charged them rent to use it and just got income every quarter from taxing the peasants who worked the land. Capitalists didn't want that. Capitalists wanted to invest in capital, right? Means of production, factories, specifically textile factories. They wanted to kick the peasants off of the land. There's a process that's called proletarianization, and turn them into factory workers, right? And then use the land to graze sheep that would then provide the input for the factory that would be combined with the workers' labor. They wanted to exploit the workers too, right? But they didn't want to exploit the workers the way the feudalists did. They wanted to combine their own capital, which they would continuously improve and invest in order to outcompete other capitalists, right? Feudalists don't have to worry about competition. If you own like a great location on a corner in Manhattan and you rent to a coffee shop, and a better coffee shop opens across the street that puts them out of business, that's good for you, not bad for you, because now your location is worth more because it's on a block with a really hot coffee shop. Right. So capitalists worry about competition. Feudalists don't. Feudalists love competition because it puts capitalists out of business and makes their property more valuable to other capitalists. And so the thing that all of these monopolists want to be more than anything else is feudalists. Right. The point of a monopoly is to own critical choke points in production so that people who have capital need to pay you some of that capital. So like the purest forms of like techno-feudalism would be like a patent troll, right? You drew a diagram for like placing ads programmatically on a web page 12 years ago. And now everybody who has ads needs to pay you rent, even though you do nothing, right? You don't own any capital. You don't own a web page. You don't own an advertising brokerage service. You don't have ads and you don't publish anything. You just collect rents from people who do all those things, from people who use capital to produce value that other people care about. And that is the economy that has captured our politics, is this rentier economy. And when you hear people talking about passive income, that's what they mean, right? They mean collecting rent by owning something that other people need in order to produce something.
You've talked, I mean, it's a really good point that you're making there about the feudalism versus the capitalism. And I think we've emphasized that a little bit also on the show. In the last few minutes of the conversation, I do want us to touch on at least some of the remedies that you wrote about in the book, because give us some hope that there's an opportunity for things to change. And pick the ones that you want to talk about. You talked about covenants and state limits and even this interop defense. I mean, that, which I thought was.
Well, so remember, the reason that companies can abuse you is because you can't escape, right? Like we've all been on the wrong side of an airport checkpoint where water costs $12. And the reason it costs that much is because leaving the checkpoint is hard. And when the checkpoints got harder right after 9/11, the cost of water went up, right? Because you are now like a captive audience. And this is why if you get a free tablet in prison from a private prison, profiteer, the MP3s that you buy cost 5 times as much as they do on iTunes, right? You are literally a captive audience. That's why commissary food costs 5 times as much. So one of the ways that you make firms better is by freeing the hostages, by making it easier to switch from one thing to another. And that's what interoperability gets us. If you can leave Facebook, but Facebook is required to, or in some other way has a gateway that whatever service you go to after you leave Facebook can use to exchange messages with Facebook users, so that the same people you talk to on Facebook send you messages in the same way. The communities that you're part of, you continue to participate in, and the customers that you relied on reaching in Facebook still can reach you. Then you can just leave Facebook, and that, you know, might discipline Mark Zuckerberg, right? He might be a little more cautious about how he shifts value from you to himself, because he's worried about losing your business, right? Once companies have to worry about losing your business, then they start worrying about keeping you happy. But even if, like, he had so much hubris that he failed to do that, well, then you could just leave, right? And you could get that value. So how do we get interoperability? Well, the one way is with mandates. And in the European Union, there's the Digital Markets Act that is going to require this of the largest tech firms, that they have these gateways. Another is with relief through settlements. So all of these companies can't help but cheat on whatever rules they do have. You know, they're all under multiple consent decrees from their regulators. They have all, you know, got tons of dirty laundry about rules that they violated. And they're all going to end up getting dragged into court eventually. And when they offer to settle, one of the settlement terms we could say is you have to have one of these gateways, right? That's the, it's you have to make it easy for users to leave. You have to make it easier for users to convert their files or recover their data or continue their social relations when they leave the platform. And so that's another good way we can say that standards bodies that want to have their standards be eligible for adoption by governments or in public safety codes will have to require their members to promise not to sue people who make interoperable products as a condition of membership. And so standards bodies definitely want to get incorporated into public safety codes and public standards. And they, you know, it's very well established that standards bodies can condition membership on covenanting not to exercise rights that you have otherwise. Like many standards bodies today, you have to promise not to use your patents against people who implement the standards you work on. And that's because historically, like, you would have companies that would have a patent that they hadn't disclosed, and they would join a standards body. They would make sure that the standard implicated their patent, and then after it became the standard and everyone had tooled up a lot of manufacturing capacity to adhere to that standard, to make standards compliant gear, they would say, oh, guess what, guys, you owe us a dime for every widget you make forever, because we had this hidden patent. It's called submarining. The most
dirty.
Yeah, very dirty. And the most egregious example is something called Rambus. So a lot of standards bodies have adopted these rules, and they've been pretty durable and good. We could say, like, for public procurement, like the government could say, look, as a matter of prudent public administration, if you're going to sell us something, you have to bindingly promise that you won't threaten anyone that we hire to improve it, right? If you're going to sell Google Classroom to a school district, we have to be able to hire anyone to, like, add new textbooks or examination or evaluation tools. If you're going to sell us a car for the motor pool, you can't sue independent mechanics or the people who serve them by making tools that allow them to get diagnostic information without without getting sued. Or we can say, if you're going to sell us phones or ask us to use your social network, you have to let us hire people to make the tools that make that easier and that support our uses. And if you don't like it, well, don't sell to Uncle Sucker then. Right? Like, no one ordered you to do it. If you're too emotionally fragile to be a supplier to a public agency, then there's someone else behind you who will take that public money. And, this has been a bedrock of good public procurement since the Lincoln administration. Like, Lincoln would only buy rifles for the Union Army if they use standard tooling and ammunition, because, like, it's kind of embarrassing to be the commander in chief and, like, be like, sorry boys, war is canceled, like, our sole ammunition supplier just decided not to make any bullets this week. So, like, there are so many ways that we can approach this interoperability and lower these switching costs, put the power of governing, of technological self-determination in the hands of technology users, and make companies fear regulation and competition again, and discipline their conduct so that they have to at least pretend like they care about keeping us happy.
Well, that'll be interesting to see if we go back to the 1930s. Unfortunately, I agree with you 100%. Unfortunately, I think it's just gotten way out of control. I think unfortunately, Mrs. O'Leary's cow has knocked the lantern over, and the cow and the horses are all out of the barn, in the field, in the city, and the barn is burning. And as much as people like you, which we commend, are trying to put it back, it's unfortunately the children, and I don't care if they're 25 or 125. I think most of them are 125 in DC that just, like,
But anything
a
that
few
can't
of
go
them,
on forever eventually stops, man. And
that
like
is true.
the America Act, which is like an act to break up the ad tech stacks, its
Right.
co-sponsors are Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
Talk about bipartisan unity.
Yep.
Right? We
Right.
are living through an extraordinary moment all over the world. The Chinese cyberspace directive breaks up and limits the power of big tech.
Mhm.
You hear these people like Nick Clegg from Facebook saying, oh, if we weaken Facebook, China will take us over because the Chinese tech companies are just an extension of the Chinese state. If that's so true, then how come Xi Jinping keeps throwing their leaders in gulags? Like, he clearly does not act like they are just an extension of Chinese soft power. He acts like they're a competitor with Chinese state power, and I think they are.
And now he's making them part of the Chinese state, whether they
Well,
like
he's
it or not.
trying. We'll see.
That's,
You
and
know?
Jack, and if you notice, since Jack Ma was thrown in a summer school, let's call it, for 6 months a few years ago, Jack doesn't say much anymore.
No, he sure doesn't.
And so when you start saying, and you go to a conference, you go, I'm bigger than the panda, I'm bigger than Mao, I'm bigger than this. They look at that and they're like, no, we don't think so, and they will come get you. And
if you are indeed, let's halt that right now, because we don't want to spend 12 years in court while you outspend the entire Department of Justice. Right? Like,
that's why we need more people reading the Internet Con, how to seize the means of competition.
A national bestseller as of this week.
And wait, national North American, like US and Canada,
USA
or
Today.
just the US? Okay, I was going to say, because Canada only has 6 people. So if it's there, if it was US is good. Congratulations on that.
Very much.
Yeah,
that is very, very cool.
That's great.
And thank you for being a guest on our show.
Thank you. Thanks, Kurt.
Kurt?
we still trade using acorns and maple syrup over here, so that's
yeah. We every maple tree gets a vote. So, but only in New Brunswick, and only if they vote for the family that owns all the newspapers and the shipping yards.
There you go.
So it's like the South. Got it.
We know Monopoly.
There you go. No, Cory, this was wonderful. Thank you very much. Please come back whenever you feel free and you want to just let something rip.
Thanks. Well, I wrote 9 books during lockdown, so this one, The Lost Cause, comes out in February. That one comes out in November rather. Okay. And then the next one, The Bezel, comes out in February. So I got a book like every 3 months until 2026. So,
well, if that's the case, then you should come back every 3 months. Right. And as my grandmother would say, you'll hawk the book. So, you'll sell the book to the fans. Yeah. Can't hurt.
Yeah. All right.
So, really appreciate the time. It's fantastic conversation.
Lovely to chat.
Cory.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right.
So that was nice. We had Michael Collins, we had Cory.
That's right.
And now for all the fans, unfortunately, that are stuck with us, we're going to do Lost and Found.
We're doing Lost and Found.
So who's lost $1 this week? And who's found $1 this week?
And there we're back. All right. So David's not here, so we'll get nothing for cocktail.
We're gonna miss the David. We're gonna miss the David.
And then John's not here, so we're gonna get no disgruntle.
No disgruntle.
So we'll start with the Canadian, Mr. Kurt. And what do you have for us?
Well, we've got Edessa Biotech. The Canadian federal government has thrown $23 million for a clinical study. Phase 3 study for the EB05 treatment of ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome, and which is caused by COVID. So they're looking at, ways to. Whoops, you're looking at way too much. They're looking at ways to combat the respiratory distress, which I guess a lot of people suffered through during COVID and killed a lot of people off. So hopefully they're successful with that. I know that $23 million is basically turkey dinner in the US, but yeah.
Actually, that's a weekend in Vegas. Just so clear. Yeah. So in fact, this weekend. In fact, all right, Michael. In fact, what do you got for us, bud?
Well, that was a found. I've got a big loss for us, or at least a loss for people who like physical media, like DVDs and Blu-ray, as I do.
Sure.
Best Buy is reportedly going to stop selling physical media because everybody's going digital and everybody's going streaming.
Oh man.
And now they're finally saying, you know what, we're not even going to bother selling it. So
Oh.
all the people who have libraries in their house, that
Right.
may unfortunately become a thing of the past. And I think that's a loss.
I do too. That's terrible. I like my books and I like my vinyl.
That's right. I want to
I'm
have
still-
it there.
Yeah, I want to like Corey sent us a book. I read the book. I made notes. It's like I like the hard thing. And heavy books are good when the kids are bad. Just boom. Anyway, you know, it's just a thing. Old-fashioned parenting. So my thing, I think, is a found. So unfortunately, it deals with unpleasantness. There was an article the other day in the FT. Why they're not sponsoring us, I don't know. But in the FT, they were talking about after Hamas did the attack on Israel, that the Arab states rallied around Israel saying, like, we agree with what you did. We agree that you had to attack. We agree with this. They agree with, you know, they're also like, let's not escalate it. Let's not get crazy. But they agree. So whatever their plan was backfired. So I think that's found, not so much in money. There's no cha-ching. I just think it's found that maybe in the region on a larger scale, we're all getting along a lot better than we all have to go kill each other. So I thought that was very nice when I read that. I was very happy to see that Qatar and the UAE and Saudi and Jordan and this one and that one were saying to Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah, like, no more. Like, stop. You're bad. Israel, you're okay. So I was very happy to see that. So it was very good.
That's a possible, that hopefully is a possible found. Let's
it's a found. That's a found.
Yeah, gotta have peace. Gotta have peace.
Yeah. Got to have peace. A pie would be nice, I think. But anyway, so everybody, thank you for listening or watching. We're glad we had Cory with us. He's got 87 books out. Here's one right here.
Here's one
if you
of
want to
them.
read it. There's one of them. If you want to read it. And for the people that were on the podcast, thank you for listening. For the people that watched us on YouTube, really? And don't forget to subscribe and like. We'll be back next Saturday at 6 a.m. New York time. The rest of you can figure out what that is, EST. And everybody will be here, I think, next week, except me. Right. I will be in the UAE in meetings, so that'll be exciting. Going where the unpleasantness is, but hopefully it'll be pleasant. And that's it. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Check out the merch store, guys. See you all later. Cheers.
All right.